Justinian and Theodora send out their soldiers to gather the factions together. Okay, this is what anybody else would call like a union meeting with all of the union heads, except for we have thousands of people brought into the hippodrome. Then the doors are locked and the soldiers slaughter tens of thousands.
The Red Wedding.
It is a red wedding.
Yeah. They're like, come in, we're going to negotiate with you. And then just kidding, you're not leaving.
Well, there's a very famous line from Tacitus saying, the Romans make a desert and call it peace.
Welcome back to the Hyperallergic Podcast. When you think about ancient Rome, what do you think about? Gladiators, arenas, chariots, columns? But do you ever think about labor? In this episode, we're talking to longtime Hyperallergic contributor Sarah Bond. Her new book is titled Strike: Labor, Unions, and Resistance in the Roman Empire. Sarah, for those of you who've been longtime Hyperallergic readers, will know she's the type of public intellectual who wants the material in the classroom and in the institution to be of interest and reach out to a public that's eager to learn more, and more importantly about ancient Rome, accurate facts, rather than the Hollywood versions we're often duped into believing. And now she's breaking open one of those other topics of the ancient world that is very little discussed: labor organizing and strikes. This is particularly poignant, of course, to hyperallergic audiences, since protests are something we cover extensively, as well as many of the issues bubbling up today, as we see with a lot of labor organizing in places that haven't had that type of energy for decades. In this episode, we discuss the very first walkout that took place in ancient Egypt, the ancient Roman emperor who staged a massacre, and we also talk about how many of the early founding fathers and leaders of the United States would often use quotes by ancient Roman writers to justify the institution of chattel slavery in this country. When we look at these ancient stories of labor and organizing, I think we really learn something about ourselves today. I'm Harag Vartanian, the editor-in-chief and co-founder of Hyperallergic. Let's get started. Well, today we have a very special episode with Sarah Bond. And anyone who's read Hyperallergic for years now is no stranger to Sarah's work. Sarah is a public intellectual, an academic, somebody who engages with the classical world for a contemporary audience and really brings to life so much. So I just first of all want to say thank you for doing that. Today, we're going to talk about your latest book, Labor, Unions, and Resistance in the Roman Empire, Strike. And anyone who's probably follows Hyperallergic knows that we love to talk about strikes. And obviously, this is of great interest to us for many reasons, including that. So welcome, Sarah.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with a little bit of your earlier life. You were born in Roanoke. Is that correct? Roanoke,
right.
Virginia.
I'm from Roanoke, Virginia.
Right.
And I don't have my Southern accent anymore until I get around my cousins and around my family. But I'm from real Appalachia as opposed to J.D. Vance, who is from fake Appalachia. But Roanoke is right in the Appalachian Mountains. And so in the South, they have Latin programs in public schools. Right. And this is a remnant specifically of the antebellum South.
Is it really?
Well, they loved classics.
Right.
Thomas Jefferson, many of the founding fathers, but especially Thomas Jefferson, wanted to always make sure that Latin was taught in public schools. Right. And so I did get the chance to take Latin as a 14-year-old going into high school. And then I kept taking it at the University of Virginia. But what changed the game is that I started working at Monticello as a archaeological field director.
Wow.
And GIS overseer, somebody who helps with the mapping. But we were working on Sally Hemings's mother's house. We were excavating what we call a subfloor pit, which is a basement. And that introduced me to enslaved people and their lives at Monticello, and thinking more deeply about enslaved persons and wanting to know more. When I went to UNC for my PhD, a professor there named Heather Williams was like, we need to know a lot more about slavery and marginalized persons for the ancient world.
Right. So did the South, the antebellum South, were they interested in classics because they were both societies with enslavement?
Exactly. And a lot of the writings that you find, particularly Aristotle was one of the ones favored by enslavers, that Aristotle seems to justify the idea of enslaved persons being lesser than, that they are given to slaving behaviors.
Right.
And so the articulation of enslaved people deserving their enslavement is something that was constantly reused and articulated by people who enslaved people as justification for their actions. So people like Aristotle, Cicero, who had a number of enslaved people who wrote down his works, for instance, they're all using literature that supports their point of view, which is that slavery should exist and that, look, the Romans did it. Why wouldn't we do it? And so they had huge classical libraries that they would pull from and that they would quote from, and that oftentimes young white men would be trained in school in both Latin and Greek to spout off the same thing.
Well, I mean, I know that the classics field is pretty patriarchal, for lack of a better word.
Go on.
And certainly very male dominated.
Absolutely. I entered UVA in 2001, and looking around at conferences, it was very apparent that not only were there not very many women in the field of ancient history, but also that, and I am also one, a lot of white people. Just, it is the whitest field that we have in the American Academy. It hovers around 2% people of color, depending at the level of tenured professors.
Wow.
And that is extremely low. And that is something that has to be addressed and that we have been addressed for many years. But the impact of a lot of the cuts to DEI and a lot of the slashing of hiring programs in higher ed, years from now, classics is not going to get any less white by these programs going away.
Yeah,
so the work continues in earnest, but it is a very patriarchal and traditional field. But there's still so much of a community that I've found within classics that are still extremely focused on social justice and change.
And so your own research has been connected to labor and now strikes. How did that come about? Why that aspect of the classics or the ancient world? What is it about those topics that speak to you?
I mean, my dad was from West Virginia, talking about railroad workers and coal miners. A lot of what we would call blue collar workers were from my family. People who get called hicks and rednecks, and people who get, oftentimes they're the villains in movies. Those are my people. And so I completely reject the racism of the South, but the blue collar nature of workers and unionization was something that's been close to my heart and my family. And when I was introduced to a lot of the people at conferences and people within classics, seeing many of them, their disinterest in artisans and labor and enslaved people at that time, and this was now 20 years ago. The field has completely changed since then, and many more people are studying slavery than ever had been prior. Thinking about labor and blue-collar workers was always important to me, and my advisor, Richard Talbert, really encouraged me to look at marginalized people and how marginalized people banded together. And specifically, how you create community within a larger state that is oppressing you.
And what I loved about this book, you mentioned that you thought this book would have been written by now. You know, and you realize that nobody had written about this topic. And you use something which you called a strategic anachronism. The word strike was invented in the 18th century in the UK, and specifically around the protests of port workers, where they would strike the sails so that ships couldn't sail out. You know, and so we get that word from there. And obviously that would, you know, the word doesn't come from antiquity, but you see strategically similarities.
So translators are doing still amazing work, but words oftentimes trip us up in the world of history. There have been a few articles and mentions, very short articles, that strikes were intermittent in the ancient world, that they didn't really exist. But to me, looking at the Latin and the Greek and trying to find out what words they were using to describe a methodology that has existed since at least 1157 BCE, describing that behavior was really important to me because I think it transcends any kind of label that we put on it.
Absolutely.
And sometimes those labels really trip us up to say, oh, this has only existed in the modern world.
Absolutely. One of the topics you talk about specifically is the first so-called strike, or the first that you see. And that took place, as you said, in Egypt in 1157 or 1155 BCE. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I also thought it was interesting that the first recorded example came from Egypt.
Right. We have a strike papyrus, which we'll show you guys in just a second. But this is called the Turin strike papyrus, and it tells us a scribe is writing down a uprising in the 29th year, I think, of Ramesses III's reign. And he has not been delivering on his promises of emmer and wheat. Money has not been invented yet as a form of technology. So we don't have coinage being paid to these individual workers. They're getting paid in kind and specifically in sustenance. And when that sustenance is being held back, of course, we have workers who are working in a necropolis called Deir el-Medina. They are artisans, they are craftspeople, they're construction workers, they're fine artists that are creating sculptures for tombs and things like this. And they're not getting paid the way that they should. And so they collectively decide to go and sit in the back of a temple that is nearby. And they just all go together. And at first they sit in the back of it, then they sit outside of it. They have various strikes that they engage in until eventually they are paid on time what they are owed. And they see this as a tactic that they are stronger together if they go sit in the back of the temple. And this is our first extant, that is to say, our first known instance of collectives withholding their labor in order to collectively bargain for better working conditions.
I think part of it is it's so interesting to me because why would they have thought that was the action to take? Like, what do you think? What do you suspect? Like, why?
Yes, I mean, there's a very good reason for this. And the biggest reason is that within ancient belief systems, there is a sacredness to the temples that they are going into. And this is where we get the word asylum from, is the right of asilia. And so they are pulling on the right of asilia in order to go sit in the back of the temple because they're inviolable. When you sit in a temple or within what we call the temenos of a temple, that is the basic grounds of a temple, no violence can be taken upon you. So let's say you want to go sit in the back of a temple in Egypt. I can't drag you out of there. And later on in early Christianity, this is what we will call sanctuary.
Right.
And this is the early development of sanctuary is the concept of asilia or asylum.
Which is what has been fighting today with the ICE raids in churches, right? So it's like, it's interesting to see how there's this long history of sacred spaces being considered places of sanctuary.
Absolutely. And I wrote on this years ago, but this happens in Greek temples. It happens in Roman temples. The idea of the sanctuary city is a very ancient one. And the idea of getting rid of sanctuary cities and the idea of sanctuary being done away with is not only anti-Christian, it's anti-religious beliefs that go back thousands of years. So if they really want to bring the Roman Empire back, they would have a little bit more respect. But it's
very selective, their understanding.
I mean,
they're
cherry picking from the Roman Empire, which really is not.
Wouldn't
how
fig picking be more appropriate?
Oh yes, yeah, they're faux picking, just up little
fig
things
here,
that they really
little thing
love.
here,
Oh, I love a laurel, but. With the Egyptian workers, they recognized that the foremen and especially the pharaoh's soldiers cannot come and drag them out of the temple. And so they're pulling on a civil right that existed then and should exist now.
One of the things about this that I thought was really interesting was how a lot of the tips you got that these were maybe strikes was they were often characterized in the written record as riots, which I think is so interesting because even today, that same, the fear like BLM, they're always talking about damaged property, right?
Yes.
Even the environmental protests at museums, right? People were like, oh my God, they might be damaging the art. Like, it's sort of like there's this like immediate idea that somehow it's about violence rather than dealing with the actual issue that they're dealing with. But this idea of a threat of violence from these masses seems to be at the basis of how the elite see these power struggles, right?
Well, as soon as you demonize somebody, you take away the legitimacy of their cause.
Exactly.
And as soon as you accuse them of violence, you have shifted the narrative then to their actions rather than the cause that they are supporting. And the First Amendment protects the right to peaceful assembly and association. And as soon as you can be called unpeaceful, as soon as you can be called violent, then you no longer are protected in your civil right. So I think that there is a long history in this country and many others of instigating violence by people who are throwing water bottles, things like this, pushing people, trying to get you to break. And MLK talks about this. Many other civil rights movement leaders talked about this. Do not give in to the people that are trying to incite the violence, because then they can call you unpatriotic.
Terrorists.
They can call you terrorists. They can call you mobs. And unions, for instance, in the late 19th and early 20th century, were completely cast as anti-American. And that was the narrative that people like President Garfield, for instance, attached to unions to cast them and to demonize them. And so the rhetoric of marginalization so that you can then break them apart is something very familiar to us in collective action today. You're right that this anti-assembly legislation and anti-assembly behavior that demonizes people that come together and congregate, calling them mobs, is something that goes back many thousands of years. The best way to pump yourself up as the hero is to make somebody else the villain.
Amen. That's exactly what it looks like. So I want to move on to one of the other protests, because one of the things I found interesting was how many of these earlier protests took place in Egypt. And as you point out, it's because there was sort of a history there before even the Romans showed up. But during the female textile worker walkout in 116 or 117 CE in Hermopolis, Roman Egypt, tell us a little bit about this. And one of the great things about the ancient world is we have like different illustrations and the incredible amount of texts, obviously. One of the things I love about your research is not only does it question who was protesting or striking, because I think the assumption was they were men. Sometimes you even mention that enslaved people were protesting, which isn't something we're used to hearing about. I think because of American slavery, chattel slavery, there is this idea of slavery being much more kind of separated from society, right? You know, skin color, these types of things. But in the ancient world, was it 20% of ancient Rome was enslaved?
20 to 25% of the entirety of the Italic Peninsula. And then about 20% of the entirety of the Mediterranean at the height of the Roman Empire were enslaved people. And there was oftentimes a direct route to manumission. And so many scholars have said over the years that, oh, well, because manumission, that is to say the freeing of an enslaved person, was more regularized within the ancient world, because you have high manumission rates that sometimes are well above 50% of people are going to be eventually freed. But those freed persons are then tied to a patron that used to own them, that they have legal ties to them still for the rest of their life.
Oh, for the rest of their life?
Yes. They still have to show up at various campaigns, to vote for them, to do various acts of service.
Wow,
so
I didn't realize it was a lifetime thing.
Strings are attached,
right.
Okay?
Did it go to your children too then?
No, it does not. Like Horace, the poet Horace, his father was a freed person. And then Horace is free to do as he pleases and to become a poet, for instance.
I see. Got it.
But it goes to your to then just you when you're freed, and that you have to still do acts of service. But the manumission levels in the United States, and I will have to look at the exact numbers. It's very low, 1% to 2% of people are ever going to be manumitted. Thomas Jefferson didn't even manumit all of his children. Right. Out of slavery.
Right.
So manumission was not as regularized. And that is not in any way a defense of Roman slavery. It's just a lot of people have explained it by saying, well, why would you rebel if you're going to be manumitted one day? Wouldn't you want to just depend on that in the future? But the fact is that enslaved people knew that they were highly skilled artisans and professionals in many ways. And so the papyrus that comes from 116 or 117 CE, we don't know the exact date on it, is a letter from a grandmother who is writing to her daughter-in-law who is pregnant and about to have a child. And she's flipping out because she has been left to watch over the textile workshop where young enslaved women work. Wow. And apparently they're going out into the streets and leaving the workshop, which is to say that they're deserting their jobs to go work at other workshops that are within this area.
I mean, that's incredible. That's incredible. Yeah. First of all, that the evidence is a letter between two women in Roman Egypt, talking about what they're experiencing. How do you see that like, how would the Romans in that period have seen that event, that strike?
They would have seen it as very economically disruptive and something where enslaved people are extremely vulnerable to being beaten, and their bodies themselves are oftentimes abused. And so I just wonder to myself, and I cannot prove this because we ask so many questions of the evidence that It may not be able to always tell us. Is the grandmother just not strong enough in terms of like her enforcement? Does she not have any backup? Does she not have any guards or people that are there within the textile workshop to enforce these young women walking out and going into the streets?
Got it.
And I don't want that to happen. I'm just saying that enslaved persons oftentimes were coerced through threat of bodily violence. And so there must be something happening in this textile workshop that is not being enforced and that they're not as afraid. But of course, there are no photographs in the ancient world as well. And so when you want to escape as a fugitive enslaved person, there are fewer bars to you leaving and going off and having a different life if you're never caught.
Right. But we have this amazing sculpture of all these textile workers working with each other, which we'll show you right now.
Yes.
So, I mean, we may have not had photography, but we have some pretty damn good visual evidence.
Yes.
About
and that's
world.
from a little bit earlier, but it's still these models that are extremely popular, especially during the period of the New and the Middle Kingdom. You can see a bunch of them at the Metropolitan Museum of Art as well. But these models oftentimes are of who you want to take with you to the afterlife. And so we have these recreations of granaries, of various textile workshops, because in the afterlife, Hrag, you're going to need clothes.
Yeah.
Okay? You're going to need clothes, you're going to need beer, you're going to need baskets.
What's the point? What's that? What kind of heaven is that?
Of course. I mean, look, you can't show up there without all of the things you need. And so all of these tombs have recreations of life to take with you to the afterlife. So clearly they want to take some nice threads with them.
Right. Absolutely. So many of these examples come from the Eastern Mediterranean, not the Western Mediterranean. And I know it's partly because urbanism was different in the Eastern Mediterranean, but it also sounds like in the case of Egypt, there was a longer tradition that predated, So why do you think that there are more examples in the Eastern Mediterranean?
Well, it's two things. One thing is that preservation is higher within Egypt than any other province within the Roman Empire. It's a very arid climate. It's super dry. We have high literacy rates, higher literacy rates, and high preservation.
Absolutely.
But second to that is that I do think that this was a cultural habit that got passed down to generations, that people tell each other what is effective and what is something that is going to work in the workplace for many generations. And in places like Ephesus, as well as areas near the Black Sea, like Pontus, Bithynia, as well as Egypt, that you have so many more records of strikes than elsewhere, which may be just an accident of preservation, or it may be, as I think it more is that this is culturally pushback against Romanization and against any other colonizer that is coming. I genuinely think, and I cannot always prove this, they are just pissed about the Romans being there. Like, we've got...
They had civilization before. They didn't see this as sort of like
Antioch is pissed, okay? Antioch is not happy that you are telling them what to do as a Roman magistrate, and that you're coming in and asking them to pay a certain amount of taxes, and that you're implementing different types of legislation that oftentimes they aren't chill with. And so I think in part it's a sentiment of pushing back against the colonizer.
Absolutely. What aspect of this sort of ancient conversation around strike and labor do you think that is perhaps the most foreign to the contemporary reader or the contemporary audience?
I think we're so used to living in a world where protest is protected and where resistance is something that we think about all the time and we write about. And asking yourself why Tacitus and some of the major historians never wrote about these protests and never wrote about these uprisings. And if they did, wrote it in a very pejorative, negative light. We tend to celebrate pushing back against the man. And that's not something Roman writers are interested in. So reading against the grain, that is to say, reading literature and texts in a new way that shows us how people are pushing back is not something that we're always trained to do, because people like Hyperallergic and many other, especially independent news outlets, are talking about protest on a regular basis. So we expect to look at the ancient world and see it everywhere. And if we don't, we think, oh, well, it must have been a nice place.
Right.
You know, it must have been like the golden age.
Was it the patronage? Like, is it that why the writers in the ancient world, because they had patrons that were often elite, that they wouldn't write about these kinds of like, you know, histories from below or histories that didn't sort of, you know, help support the sort of the moneyed interests?
Right. Well, a lot of these writers themselves are extremely wealthy.
Right.
Tacitus is a senator.
Class solidarity a little bit.
Exactly. Yeah. They're writing for a specific audience.
Right.
We all write for the audience that we want to reach.
Right.
Right. And so Tacitus, Suetonius, many of our major historians, they are of the belief that vulgarity starts with the people from below. Like the word vulgar only means pedestrian. It is lower class.
Hoi polloi.
Yes. History as a discipline at that time was supposed to be specifically a record of military and political accomplishments. The quotidian, the daily life, the things that I love reading about in things like Petronius or Apuleius that we do have records of, that's not considered to be history. The people that we allow into our narratives are the people that we have respect for.
Right.
And Tacitus has no respect for the people from below. And this movement for history of below really doesn't start until after a lot of the Marxist philosophies and histories from below of the mid-19th century going forward. So that's when we really start seeing like the people's history of the United States later on, or like, you know, the Bolshevik rebellion that inspires a lot of people to write histories from below. And that Tacitus is just not interested in that.
So one of the things that was sort of I really enjoyed was how you tried to recontextualize and understand anew some events that were often sort of, you know, pretty popular, famous events that people didn't know. And the Nike riots are one of them. And that's in Constantinople. And this was a riot that took place, or strike perhaps, or how we describe it. But the word that's come down to us is riot, at least the way it's sort of commonly discussed. But it was between these groups at the circus the forum. What is it?
Oh, the circus is the same as the hippodrome.
Okay,
you can
so
call
the hippodrome
it
or the circus.
Yeah.
Just for the audience who may not know the difference. So I just want to be clear.
In the Latin West, it's called circus. And then in the Greek East, it's called a hippodrome.
Right, hippodrome. So in the hippodrome were these groups that protested or sort of stood up. What was it that they were protesting at the time?
Right. So the most popular sport in the 6th century CE in Constantinople, which is what is modern day Istanbul, is chariot races.
Right.
And so we have 4 main teams, and we'll show you guys a mosaic of this, but it's the blues and the greens and the reds and the whites. And they're just the major charioteer factions.
Right.
And in Latin, in the singular, that's a factio, or you can call factiones, and it's where we get the word faction today. But they're just the teams. But those teams are gigantic into the thousands.
Right.
And so we can have veterinarians, doctors, horse trainers, assistants, bear trainers, dancers, mimes, a lot of mimes, a lot of actors
Wow.
that are within it. These are the largest entertainment troops that we have from the ancient world in the 6th century are these factions. And about every 5 days, they put on races in the circus. But the thing is that charioteers oftentimes involve themselves because they are incredibly famous and they have a lot of social capital.
Celebrity.
Celebrity
Right.
is very much a part of this, that they have great power to speak directly to the emperor, because the emperor has a box within the hippodrome. But also, if you're a very famous charioteer, you can oftentimes speak to them more directly as an interlocutor between the populace and those people in power. And so we have a lot of charioteers, not just at Constantinople, but at places like Thessaloniki, which in the ancient world is called Thessalonica, at Alexandria, and elsewhere, that we know had a lot of sway with magistrates. And in this particular instance, a little bit earlier in the year 532, we have the arrest of various members of the Blues and Greens factions.
Which were the biggest teams.
Yeah, two biggest, most popular teams. So just imagine today, oh gosh, how much would things break out if like an NFL quarterback were arrested?
Right, exactly.
Or, you know,
so that's a good example, like Major League Sports.
Major League Sports,
right.
Okay? And so we have them arrested, and then we have a botched killing of a number of them by the state, and two of them survive. And so the heads of the Blues and the Greens go to Justinian's people, and Justinian and Theodora are the emperors at the time, and they say, can you release these two people who survived this botched execution, essentially, and release them? And they say, no, we're not going to release them. We're not going to, these are rabble rousers. These are people that are leading protests and causing riots within it. And then mass violence throughout Constantinople breaks out for numerous days. And so we have multiple days where pivotally the hippodrome is not in use. We do not have. So I guess the question is then, is that a strike?
It's a withholding of labor, right?
They are out protesting in the streets. They cannot do their job, but they're also choosing not to do their job.
So that's the thing. It's like, so you're taking it in terms of withholding labor, right? You know, which is what a strike is, essentially.
Right, but when Procopius writes about it, who is our main source for the Nika riots, and it's called that because in Greek, when you go Nika, 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 that's conquer. It's
I see. Got it.
Where we get the
and
Nike.
I'm calling it Nike.
No, that's the goddess of victory. It's
That's
the same.
right.
It's the same. It derives from the same word.
Oh, it does. Okay.
So you have conquer, or you can say victory, essentially.
Gotcha.
And so that's why your shoes are called Nike.
I
is
see.
after the goddess. But Nika is just a cheer that you do in the hippodrome. So Procopius tells us about this, but Procopius is part of the state apparatus.
Right. So tens of thousands of people die.
Yes. So what eventually happens is a collective bargaining meeting, is that Justinian and Theodora send out their soldiers to gather the factions together. Okay, this is what would anybody else would call like a union meeting with all of the union heads, except for we have thousands of people brought into the hippodrome. Then the doors are locked and the soldiers slaughter every thousands of them. I mean, tens of thousands.
The Red Wedding.
It is a red wedding.
Yeah.
It is, and something.
So they're like, come in, we're going to negotiate with you. And then they sort of like, just kidding, you're not leaving.
Well, there's a very famous line from Tacitus saying, the Romans make a desert and call it peace.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Right. And so what they're doing is creating a desert and then going, the riots are over, guys. The riots are up.
They don't explain how they were over.
Deserts come sometimes from the creation of man and from the violence of individuals. And so those soldiers are carrying out the will of Theodora, apparently, who is saying that she gets the blame for it, but also Procopius hates her, so I'm not sure. But Justinian and Theodora decide the best way to get rid of resistance is killing everybody.
So Roman.
It is Roman, and
So
it had
Roman.
happened previously under other administrations, under an emperor named Theodosius, that about 5,000 people had been killed at Thessalonica in the same manner.
Oh, wow.
So this isn't the first time.
The history of these kinds of slaughter.
Exactly. When there is resistance, Romans will come back one louder and then just decimate.
Sounds very American, doesn't it?
It's a lot of violence. It is, I think that Romans are an example in many ways and not a positive example.
So, in this, I'd love to ask you because, the ancient world gets thrown around a lot now because of the sort of the people in power right now. Let's not name them right now, but we know who they are. What is it about the ancient world that they don't understand you wish they understood? Because from what I've seen in your work, I get the sense that people had much more agency than people like to give them credit for. Does that sound accurate?
Exactly. I think thinking as many did that Romans did not have the capacity to strike is one way that we take away the agency from the people of the ancient world. And we say, we're just modern people. We're better. We're more progressive.
Right.
We have more technology. And just because we're living in a modern world doesn't necessarily mean that individuals from the past didn't have agency. It's simply that the elite writers who were writing about it don't give it to them. They don't give them the dignity of telling us about a lot of their actions or beliefs or giving us a lot of individual personhood. But I think understanding that the people of the past were much smarter, much more complex, and we're talking about enslaved people, we're talking about regular laborers and things like this, then we have necessarily a full understanding of. And that's just simply because most people are only talking about emperors still to this day. When I go and I look at the bookshelves at Barnes & Noble, or I look at any of the other bookstores, I see more representation of persons from below, but it's still predominantly books that are about emperors. And right now, there's a best-selling translation by Tom Holland of Suetonius, of the Caesars. And Tom Holland was the advisor for succession. Okay? So Rome creeps into our pop culture
everywhere.
Yeah, and I'm not bashing on Tom Holland. I'm just saying that he's translating Suetonius for a new audience. What does Suetonius write about? The lives of the 12 Caesars.
Right.
And so if we choose to only read about the Caesars, then we're only going to see Caesar within Rome. And the fact is 60 million people lived within the ancient Mediterranean.
That's a lot of people.
60 million people. Yeah. One person was emperor, although there are some usurpers and various
and
sometimes it's multiple ones and people are killing each other, like the year of the 4 emperors.
Right.
But why are we focusing so much on this 1.5%, which we think are super elite rich people, and not the 98.5% that were not senators, not what we call equestrians, which were also a very wealthy class, but were just regular people, merchants, people going about their daily life? If we invest our dollars in books and documentaries that are exploring more of that life, I think we will see the books change on the shelves as well.
I'm with you. So. And I think it's interesting because in the case of the Nika riots, I think in art history, for instance, when we think of Justinian and Theodora, there are beautiful monuments to them. We don't talk about this sort of the violence and the absolute terrible, things they did during their reigns, right? And it's interesting how art, just like documents that come down to us, sort of sanitize and whitewash these histories.
Metonyms do that, don't they?
Exactly.
They just allow
Theodora,
for laundering.
we think of her beautiful gold mosaic, not her, ordering the slaughter of tens of thousands of people who just wanted their rights.
Yeah. And she comes from a faction background. Her father had been a bear trainer. And so she...
J.D. Vance.
One of the things that people turning on their background is something that really disturbs me. And so
it's very common among the elite, right? And that's the thing. It's this idea of even Alexander Hamilton, right? It's such a part of this. And I think that's something that the U.S. and ancient Rome had, this idea that you could be a common enslaved baker and then turn out to be a rich person that builds a monument in the middle of Rome.
And Romans are still going to hold it against you as a way of bringing you down a peg in politics, for instance. But even Justinian had come from very humble origins because his uncle had been the one that originally was raised to the purple, and they came from very humble backgrounds in Thrace originally.
But they had to show their loyalty to the elite.
Exactly. So they're trying to use their power in order to silence people who are pushing back against them. And charioteers were sometimes the biggest leaders of political speak because they can actually speak truth to power in a way because they have the protection of popular support.
Yeah.
Just like actors today.
I'd love to ask you sort of general observations you have now that you've done this important archival research, also of what we can learn today about it. Because, museums particularly have become the focus of so much strike and labor organizing and protests in a way that I think we've never had before, right? And my theory is that it's partly museums are those places because we have very few places we consider public, that we spend time lingering, looking, expecting something new in the world, right? There are very few places we do that. Like even in a sports arena, you're not waiting for something new. You're maybe a good shot or something, but it's not the same thing. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about why you think museums, perhaps, where a lot of these objects that we're talking about are stored, why they've become the focus of some of these conversations.
I think that we have people who are realizing their worth within museum spaces, and that they are seeing that they're not just cogs contributing to a larger kind of arts movement, that they are not being well paid, especially within museums. I would love to see more librarians unionize, because I think that that is another space that is incredibly important and is suffering from a lot of book bans right now and a lot of modification from above.
Yep.
And so I think having librarians would be strengthening this movement even more. But I think you're right that we're seeing it within museums, because museum workers are very much speaking to each other, but also realizing that they thought that they were contributing to the public good by working in a museum space.
Such a good point.
And that is so valuable to say.
No one joins a museum and goes, "Oh, I'm part of the elite."
No, of course. You're saying like, I want to contribute to society in a positive way.
Educate people, school groups.
These are good people.
Right,
they're coming together because they're realizing that their individuality and their dignity is not being fully served or understood. And they know history oftentimes better than many historians. That these museum workers, I think, are seeing that collective action is effective, that unionization reaches its height in America in the 1950s, and that it has decreased, and the rhetoric against unions is coming back right now. But we are seeing at places like Amazon, at places like Starbucks, that this is an effective tactic. And so I think museum workers really are setting an example for many other parts of the country that I hope follows suit to it. But what we're already seeing with the judiciary especially is that, and Donald Trump's various Truth Social and his tweets and things like this, our union busting efforts are already ramping up.
Right.
And so this happened in ancient Rome. There will always be attempts to break up collective actions and to call it by another name. So I think museum workers are realizing that they still want to serve the public good, but maybe that public good is through unionization.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that's so important about your work is you don't let people get away with this pseudo history. You're like, no, let's look at what the actual facts are here. Because I do think some of the idealization that certain elites have of the ancient world is that it was more ordered. Do you know? And that protests didn't take place in the same way, and slaves knew their place, and all these kinds of like bullshit Hollywood. I mean, really, let's blame Hollywood for a lot of this, right? I don't know. It sort of mimicked European colonialism in the way it sort of like viewed the world as these sort of like haves and have-nots and populations that deserve to be, put down.
And things like Stoicism reinforce this. We see right now that Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, almost every single technocrat, Peter Thiel, they all love Stoicism. And we have to ask ourselves,
Why?
Oh, because broicism, as we call it. And I give the props.
Is that really a term you guys
I want to say that Joel Christensen, who is a good friend, he calls it broicism, and I do as well. And people love a good Marcus Aurelius quote. And that is because Stoicism reinforces the social order. And what do technocrats want except for you to just sit at your desk and to code and don't ask questions.
Right. Follow the order.
Because Marcus Aurelius says, I was born emperor. It was essentially fate that I become emperor. And if you believe in a fatalist approach and that you should be the best slave you could be and be the best coder that you should be and be the best emperor that you ever could be, that's kind of what Stoicism ingrains, is not protesting, not overthrowing the status quo. Reinforce the status quo, make it the best status quo you could be. Of course, Stoicism is something that is getting a revival. If you look at the Amazon list right now, with Jeff Bezos very much a part of this movement, Marcus Aurelius' Meditations is always at the top.
It always is. It's so surprising to me. that happens.
Yeah.
I mean, I like the meditations, but it's so strange.
But, being the best slave you could be is such a thing that a technocrat would say, right? It's like, don't push back against your dominus or domina, that is to say your enslaver. Don't push back against them. Just live every day to the best of your ability. And it's like, bitch, I don't want to be a slave anymore. That's what Romans are saying. And so when we look at films like Spartacus, we have to look at the actual meaning behind that and why it was filmed in 1960 as part of the blacklist. This is pushing back against McCarthyism and the blacklist. And so there is a reason that Spartacus comes out in 1960, right? It's because it's like, screw the Hollywood elite that have been throwing out people who are perceived of as communists. And so even when we do have resistance from ancient Rome, there's a reason for that, because it was all a metaphor for what was going on in Hollywood at the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. That absolutely makes sense. So the last question, I mean, this has been such a great conversation, is I want you to pick your favorite artwork from the ancient world. Do you have a favorite?
I do. And it's meaningful to me for a lot of reasons. There is a mosaic at the Worcester Art Museum, and Hrog knows my love for the Worcester Art Museum.
I love it too. It's such a lovely museum.
It's just one of those spaces that my husband is from Worcester, and I always go back and visit it. Yeah, he's from the heart of the Commonwealth. But the Worcester Art Museum has a ton of the Antioch mosaics that were excavated in the 1930s. But there's specifically one that's hanging on the wall, and it has Ctisis, and she is the goddess of foundations and beginnings. And it's who you speak to when you build a new house, when you start anew, that you speak to this goddess and you say, Ctisis, be here for my new foundation, for my new job, for my new whatever. I mean, it's usually for the foundations of cities, but I love Ctisis, and she is a woman, oftentimes with a crown on her head. But I love mosaics, and I love mosaicists, and so
I love that.
This is perhaps my favorite. It's a late antique mosaic, and Antioch doesn't flourish for that much longer after that, at that time. But
it was the great earthquake, right?
We have one not long after that. And so we have a lot of upheaval that is happening in the midst of foundation. And so I have a lot of pictures of her.
Oh, wow. I love that. So can we ask her for helping us with the foundations of the new world we're embarked upon?
Oh my gosh.
Can we do that? How would we do that? What would be
I think we got to build our house on some serious Ctisis together. But coming together as, I don't mean to sound too earnest when I say this, but I think digitally we can all come together, but also as supporters of this new labor movement. I don't want it to die with this new administration. That we saw some of the most important and most amazing labor organizing in the wake of COVID-19, and we saw so many new movements of people collectivizing that are so important. And so, if we can speak to Ctisis and help us to move forward, I think unions are one way that we'll find community as we're trying to survive what is a very horrendous political moment.
It is.
Yeah. So we got to lean on each other, but also we got to know our worth and fight for it.
From your lips to the goddess's ears.
Come on, Ctisis.
I love it.
Let's go.
Let's go. Next phase. Okay. You heard it here first. So thank you, Sarah, for always being so open and wonderful, and for doing this important research to sort of expand our minds, to not get stuck in the contemporary without understanding. And also, more importantly, not allowing other people to hijack this history, right? In order to then make claims that are not justified. So I just think it's so important, and I don't know anybody doing it with the sensitivity and with the real contemporary ear that you have. So thank you so much, Sarah. It's such a pleasure to learn from you.
I love being here. Thank you, guys. Thanks for listening in.
Thanks so much for listening. This episode was produced by Isabella Sigalovich. And this podcast, as well as all our podcasts, are supported by Hyperallergic members. So thank you to the Hyperallergic members. You too can support independent arts journalism for just $8 a month or $80 a year, and help us tell these stories that often no one else is telling. My name is Hrog Vartanyan. I'm the editor-in-chief and co-founder of Hyperallergic. Thanks for listening. Until next time.